Today on Curveball, something a little different. It's the rather extraordinary story of how a young man called Malcolm McGregor eventually became Cate McGregor. So I do want to let you know that this episode does contain discussion of addiction, suicidal ideation and gender identity. It is a really fantastic interview, but if any of these topics are difficult for you, please take care while listening, and we'll put a list of support services in our show notes. In 1974, a 17-year-old cadet named Malcolm McGregor marched across the parade ground at Duntroon, already commanding soldiers. On the outside, this young man was destined for greatness. But on the inside, he was hiding a secret that might cost him everything.
I can still remember the day. It was the last day of October 2012. There was a front page splash in one of the Sunday tabloids about Westerly Windina, I think was the name of someone who'd previously been known as Peter Druin, a world champion surfer, who'd transitioned genders. It hit me really hard. I read this, whatever loose thread was hanging, everything unravelled. But something, the tectonic plates in my psyche shifted in some way, and it started acute gender dysphoria.
From commanding troops to battling alcoholism, Catherine McGregor's life has been a path of survival, reinvention, and ultimately grace. Cate McGregor, welcome to Curveball.
Hi, Kelly.
Let's go back to Duntroon in the mid-70s. As I said, you were so young but already highly ambitious, beginning a military career that would really define your life for decades.
Mm.
What drew you into that world of the military in the first place?
It's a really good question, and one that I'm asking myself now. I'm 70 at my next birthday, and I think this psychiatrist Carl Jung described this as the afternoon of life, when you really do start to ask yourself a lot of existential questions. So I sometimes wonder how it would seem in light of what's happened that I was an unlikely soldier, especially an infantry soldier. But it made sense to me. I suspect that it was very much something I imbibed from my dad. Dad died in 1964. He was very young. He was only 43. But although he'd gone out and become, a businessman after the war, I think Dad, in some ways, always just thought he was an Australian soldier. He had an incredible affinity for it. He was. The only stories I remember of him were when he would talk about his time in New Guinea, where he served with the 2nd AIF. So I suspect somehow I picked up his values in that regard. I was enthralled by war stories and books. I don't want to spend the whole podcast on one answer, but just in brief, I got very sick when I was in grade 1. And in short order had 2 doses of measles and then got pneumonia and nearly died. And I was very, very unwell. The result being that I was off school for most of my first year at school, and I started to read with my mum helping me. She was a qualified teacher. And I started to read way beyond my years and started to read books on Hannibal's campaigns in the Punic Wars, and I started to read encyclopedias about the campaigns of the Roman Empire. So I think somehow I just got absolutely fixated about things military and the study of warfare. And I guess you're just very formative at that stage. So as long as I can remember, I had that interest in those things. I can honestly say I never contemplated anything else other than going to the Royal Military College. From that high, when I was a child, I used to say to Dad I wanted to go. I had the recruiting brochures for Duntroon before I could even apply. And I remember saying to him, will you come and see me when I'm commissioned, and he used to say, I'll be there on my walking frame. As it turned out, he wasn't. But yeah, I think that was the long explanation as to how that happened.
And doing things early, you know, reading these books that a high school student would probably read when you're meant to be in grade 1, and then you're in your early 20s, you're already commanding troops, which is such a big deal. How were you able to rise so quickly in the military?
That was very standard. I don't want to overstate all I did was graduate from RMC, as my whole cohort did. It was a very Spartan place in that era, very demanding, a 4-year course modelled on Bridges, who was the first commandant, Sir William Throsby Bridges. He's interred on the slopes of Mount Pleasant near the college. As part of the bastardisation, we had to memorise the inscription on his grave. We all graduated to an arms corps or a logistics corps. I chose infantry. So I was just one of my cohort, but I went to an infantry battalion, and I was given the most extraordinary honour as a 21-year-old kid to lead a rifle platoon, about a third of whose members, all of whose NCOs had served in the Vietnam War. I look back on that and wonder how I did it. I was, a staggering responsibility to have command authority over those soldiers and to earn their respect too. And I can, with a straight face, say I was a good officer and I was well regarded by those soldiers, some of whom I've stayed in touch with to this day.
It was as I understand, a conservative Catholic upbringing. You're in Toowoomba, which is in regional Queensland.
Yep.
What was happening sort of around those teenage years for you outside of, wanting to be in the military? What was the rest of childhood like?
No, I was an absolute goody-goody. I was a bookworm. I was incredibly motivated by study. My darling mum used to insist that my sister and I studied music, so we used to do the old handwritten musical theory, putting in claves and autoclaves or whatever they're called, and I resisted that. To my great chagrin these days, I had wonderful opportunity to learn how to play the guitar and read music, and I blew that, and sadly. I played a lot of sport. I was a pretty decent cricketer. I played rugby league. Toowoomba, other than Catholicism, the main religion at my school was rugby league. I was pretty decent at sport. Mum was very religious, and after my father's death, she remarried some years later and married a man who'd been a Christian brother. So they were pretty strict parents, pretty religious. So I was a bit of a sort of geek, frankly. I didn't go out. They wouldn't let us do much. I didn't have much of a social life.
So at that time, you were known as Malcolm.
Yep.
Were you already thinking about your sexuality even as a teenager, a young man?
Not sexuality so much, but I certainly did feel conflicted about gender, for sure. I can remember there was an occasion when they didn't have enough girls to perform parts in a dance for the end of year class, and they allocated a couple of us to make up the line for the dancing. It was a Dutch extraction dance that was being performed, and I remember being very unnerved by that, worrying that because all my friends were rebelling against it, I didn't want to be shamed in that way, and I felt kind of conflicted because I wasn't ashamed. I thought, just something felt different to me. And I furtively tried on some of Mum's clothes a couple of times and wasn't very good at concealing that I'd done that, and she was very, very upset when she found that out. I remember giving me a terrible talking to about it, saying it was sinful and something wasn't right. But I was drawn to that, and that was at a very, very young age, way before onset of puberty or any kind of sexual identity had emerged. So I guess those feelings of some degree of conflict were pretty early.
So given how early that was, I think it probably played out in so many ways in your life subsequently. You've said that the moment you had your first drink, you knew it was going to be a reckoning. How did drinking sort of start for you, and was it about allowing your Was it covering up things? Was it allowing you to be in the world in a certain way?
Well, what I know about drinking now, I didn't know at the time, in that I've got an enormous benefit of hindsight and depth perception on it. My elder brother had a terrible experience and ended up in Alcoholics Anonymous in 1968. I can remember the family going with him to a rehab, and he got sober and stayed sober, never drank again until his death in 2016. And alcohol had raged through his life, and there was a lot of alcoholism sprinkled through the family on both sides. It was a country town, all the pubs were always raucous, and it was a real rite of passage. But as I said, Mum was very protective, and I wasn't allowed to go out much, so I was kind of the goody-goody, and I just assumed I could never go off the rails the way my brother had. So I arrived at Duntroon and was given access to alcohol for the first time, and it did produce an instantaneous sense of ease and comfort in me, that's for sure. Because I was a shy kid, and I still consider myself an introvert. People assume because I've had some profile and some career in the media and I can talk to a camera, they assume I'm an extrovert and I'm gregarious. I'm not. I'm very shy. I'm introverted and can easily lapse into my own company. Alcohol lit me up, and I didn't realise at the time. What it did was it allowed me to fit into a very, very alpha environment. I didn't get into trouble immediately, but within a year of picking up a drink, I was blacking out regularly, which is not having a memory where I'd ended up the night before. And I became a gregarious, extroverted sort of ratbag. And in that climate where I was seen as studious, a good cadet, I was always impeccably turned out. I never got into trouble. I think that sort of added to some degree of acceptance and allure. I developed a reputation as this, wild character, irreverent, risk taker. And in the battalion, when I graduated, I think my rock bottom on alcohol came later because we would have long periods away. We'd go out on exercises and field training where we didn't have access to alcohol for long periods. But back-end loading the story, when I ended up with access to alcohol daily, I ended up being a daily drinker and a very, very sick alcoholic. But in the meantime, the army was actually a structured environment. I stole a vehicle once on a field exercise with one of my NCOs, and it was a great case study in leadership. I was drunk. They'd brought out the old 2 cans per day, per man, perhaps kind of thing at halfway mark of an exercise out in the Shoalwater Bay training area. I had 2 cans and in very short order was drinking those of the people who didn't want theirs. And I can still remember one of my section commanders, good fellow by the name of Hans Gratz. So if Gratzy ever hears this, he's welcome to find me on socials. I'd love to see him again. And we knocked off the Land Rover that belonged to the major commanding B Company 8-9 RAR, drove into the Shoalwater Bay pub and got on the scoot, drove the vehicle back. And I didn't remember the last part of the evening. Anyway, the next day the CO wanted to see me. He could have court-martialed me or formally punished me, but because I was seen as a pretty sound operator, he gave me 28 extra duty officers, which was the high end of a informal administrative punishment rather than charging me with a formal offence. And that just added to my reputation. I used to be on duty in the guardhouse of an evening, and all the old senior NCOs would shut the sergeant's mess, which was part of my remit, was to shut all the boozers and collect the takings and secure them. And a couple of these old guys from the Korean War who were crusty old NCOs used to come in and salute me and give me the takings and give me a beer from the sergeant's mess, even though I wasn't supposed to be drinking. And my reputation was enhanced by this kind of act of alcoholic depravity. And the guys just thought I was wild, competent, but made of the right stuff as it was, old school infantry officer. And I kind of got away with it for a while, but where it eventually reached a reckoning was when I was working for Bob Carr. And I was Bob's main political advisor and media advisor and stuff, but I had access to alcohol all the time. The bar at Parliament would be open during sitting hours. I would be drinking with journalists, some of whom were pretty serious drinkers themselves, and my life spiralled out of control. And eventually I got sober. And I went to him, I think, at about 90 days sober and said, look, I think I need to get out of this building and rehabilitate myself, get on with my life. And I went with his blessing. We parted on good terms, and we're still close to this day.
What did it take for you to get sober? Was it a rock bottom moment and then a slow claw back? And I know you probably still go to Alcoholics Anonymous today.
Yeah, I hit a rock bottom, and it was bad enough for me. The state I was in, I was physically very, very, very sick. I was drinking a lot every day, passing out wherever I ended. And I wasn't eating. I was malnourished. I'd had a couple of grand mal seizures, one of which I had when I was on a European trip. Bob and I went to Europe to the German Social Democratic Party Congress in December 1989 when the Berlin Wall's coming down. So I'm oblivious as history is on a pivotal moment. I thought I was going to die. I really thought I was going to die. The symptoms of withdrawal, even after a few hours without a drink, were terrifying. And I was a militant atheist. I was very intellectually superior, but I can remember lying on the floor of a house on the 3rd of June 1990, and I had my last drink on the 2nd of June 1990, and I prayed to a God I didn't believe in and just said, please let me live. And one thing led to another, and I haven't had a drink since the 2nd of June 1990. And
congrats.
Yeah, well, I can't claim any credit for that. I really can't. People who aren't alcoholic tend to say nice things, and it's thank you for that. But my best efforts and best thinking ended up in the state that I was in, and I've needed a power that is greater than myself to stay sober, and I've found that elsewhere. So it's a long story.
You, of course, during all of that, you're also, you're working in politics, as you say, you're in the military, cricket commentating comes in, you're operating a lot of these very male environments, but you are still battling with your gender. What happened in that sort of 2012, 2013 era for you when you decided, look, I think I do have to come to terms with what's happening inside of me?
That summer is, how do I phrase this? Some of my memories of that time, the more I look back on it now, I wonder whether I didn't end up quite traumatised through grief and dysphoria, and then the psychiatrists and others were medicating me. I can remember what happened, and I'd gone into therapy about a year before, in that I was getting a bit of midlife crisis, sort of depression, anxiety. I was in my mid-50s. I'd probably developed an eating disorder, and I sought some help with that, and I had a dramatic weight loss, which a lot of friends thought was, people were asking me whether I had cancer and I was dying, and I wasn't. I'd never been fitter. I'd eliminated sugar and processed foods from my diet, and I was just being careful about what I ate. And I think it was a perfect storm. I do think subtly sugar had occupied the place that alcohol had long occupied in my life. I think because I was so extraordinarily fit, I was a very good runner, trained on weights, played a lot of sport, got into my 50s at the same weight that I'd been at the Royal Military College, and it started to creep up a bit, and I blamed the food, eliminated all those foods, experienced dramatic weight loss, and I think probably to some extent whatever medicating, numbing effects the sugar consumption was having on me, I might have abandoned that. I can still remember the day. It was the last day of October 2012. There was a front page splash in one of the Sunday tabloids about Westerly Windina, I think was the name of someone who'd previously been known as Peter Druin, a world champion surfer, who'd transitioned genders. And it kind of hit me, it hit me really hard. I read this article and whatever loose thread was hanging, everything unravelled. From the moment I read that article, that Sunday morning, until I ultimately made the decision to transition. I didn't have a moment's peace. I have not got words to describe what the summer of 2011 going into 2012 felt like. But something about reading that article, and she was older than I was, and I thought, holy dooly, there's someone who's actually transitioned even older than I am now. And I don't know what happened, but something, the tectonic plates in my psyche shifted in some way, and it started acute gender dysphoria. And I saw my shrink that week. I was doing weekly sessions with the therapist that I was seeing, and I broke down. Absolutely broke down. I was just sobbing and said, I have this feeling I might be transgendered. And I had mentioned earlier trans-ideation to this therapist about 18 months before during the therapeutic process, and just laughed at it. I said, wow, I just think I nearly did that in the 1990s. And we didn't address it any further. And then I was writing a book on the Indian tour of Australia that year, and I went to all the test matches, and I was suicidal right through the summer. It's just, I don't have words to describe what it felt like. I couldn't sleep. I got triaged to see a psychiatrist who started to medicate me, and I think it's very dangerous for someone with my history of substance abuse to take Valium, and I think some of my I think some of my memories are clouded by the fact that I was fairly heavily medicated. And I struggled through, and it was just ghastly. I delivered the book. I divulged in the book ultimately that I was going to embark on this course, and I had some extraordinary experiences. I planned to end my life on Australia Day 2012. As I said, every doctor I saw was shoveling sleeping tablets and sedatives at me. And I just couldn't stand it anymore. And on the morning of Australia Day, I'd been gazetted that day as being awarded the Order of Australia for exceptional service to the Australian Army. It should have been the proudest day of my life. Ricky Ponting was in the same list. And Cricket Australia announced at lunch that this cricket writer and punter had been awarded the Order of Australia, and the Adelaide Oval rose and applauded. And Ian Chappell asked the folks in the media box to stand up and give me a round of applause. Just extraordinary. And I was planning my own suicide, and I'd kept all the sleeping tablets and sedatives, and I just was at the end of it. I thought, I can't do this. I'm in dire straits. And it did have its lighter moments. I had a panic attack, really bad panic attack. I was sitting on the floor of the media box having these palpitations and hyperventilating. They got the Indian team doctor to come up because I think they all thought I was having a cardiac arrest or something. And I remember him coming in, he took my vital signs and said, your heart rate's off the charts, and is there something bothering you? And I thought,
well,
you're probably a really nice guy and a very competent doctor, but you might be better at dealing with Ishant Sharma's calf strain or VVS Lakshman's dodgy wrist. I don't think I need to drop gender dysphoria on you at lunchtime on Australia Day. And anyway, he said, can you get somewhere safe? And I said, well, I live in Canberra. I can't leave until the test match is over. And he patted me on the arm and said, well, don't worry, my friend, we have been rubbish on this tour. You will be in your own bed tomorrow night. And we both had a laugh at that. And that night, there's a guy, two really good mates, Sam Collins and Jared Kimball were really good buddies of mine. We went to have dinner, and in the lovely twilight, it was the last night of the series. I can still remember all this really vividly, and we used to play scissors, paper, rock to see who paid the bill, or rather had a had a quiz about cricket, and these guys were geeks. I know my cricket pretty well, but the final question to determine who would pay the bill was what 5 counties did Marcus North play for. And I got 4 but missed out on Warwickshire, as it turns out. So I scored the bill. And then Raul Dravid and VVS Lakshman and Kohli walked past, and they sat down and had a cup of tea with us. And I'd spoken to Dravid a couple of times on that summer, and I'd asked him to help me with the book, and Raul and I ended up becoming something of friends, and something about the energy in him. He had a very deep metaphysical kind of calm. And I remember the active plan to commit suicide sort of evaporated over the dinner, of course, the dinner with laughing with Sam and Jared. And yeah, Jared wrote Marcus North saves Catherine McGregor's life as this great column for Substack or somewhere. It's a very funny read when you have a look at it, and I've still got it. But as I went home to the hotel and I flushed all the meds down the drain and decided I wouldn't end my life that night, and then I went home.
This is Curveball, and my guest today is Cate McGregor, a military expert, somebody who's written speeches for the likes of General David Morrison, a cricket commentator, and someone who has also transitioned. We'll have more of Curveball shortly. Catherine McGregor, cricket commentator, military historian, is my guest on Curveball today. Leading up to this, you were married, you've got your family, you've got this incredible sort of group of people you know very well in politics, in cricket, in the military. How was everybody else responding, seeing you in this moment of great unravelling?
People were worried about me, I know. The dramatic weight loss, which was actually benign, people thought something was wrong. So when I divulged to some people that I was having gender dysphoria and terrible anxiety and I was in a mess, they went, well, thank goodness it's not cancer. That's what David Morrison, the Chief of the Army, said to me, and someone else said the same thing. Some of the key people in Australian cricket and the military were extraordinarily decent and supportive. I didn't come out publicly for a long time. There's a few myths that have emerged about this. There's a bunch of people who've said that I, have milked the transition and I'm famous for being famous and I've never done anything else, which is absolute bollocks. I had a nationally syndicated column in the 1990s. I was on the founding panel of Insiders with Barry Cassidy, the first show. I was a regular on Insiders until I walked away from the media to go back into the military. So I was I had some profile, but I was very stealthy about this. And the Army, people again think the Army's a really strange place to transition, but that line from the Agincourt speech has been true in my estimation, in that we few, we happy few. I can still remember the night that I came out. I'd been off on all kinds of, I'd been very unwell mentally, suicidal. I'd started hormone treatment and eventually I'd resolved that I needed to tell people, and I sent an email to a large number of the senior leadership of the Army on a Friday evening. And sorry, I'm getting quite emotional about it.
It's all right. Take a breath.
Yeah, but I can remember still, I'm a textbook baby boomer. We're talking old technology, being 2012. But even then, people had devices. I thought I was buying some breathing space, putting it out like a classic media drop on the Friday afternoon deadline. And within seconds, I'm getting responses from all the generals in the Australian Army, many of whom were peers or even younger than I was, because I'd had a bifurcated career. David, as the senior soldier, custodian of values, an RSM of the old school, addressed, "Dear ma'am, thank you for sharing this with us." He didn't need to be told, just chose the correct salutation, and I knew then I was safe. A lot of stuff was written about me, and some of it's a blur, to be honest, in that I think I was really traumatised. I got a terrible amount of abuse and invective on social media. I wasn't in great shape mentally, so I retaliated. I shouldn't have, but it was hard to look the other way at some of the egregious crap that was being written about me.
Do you regret any of that?
Absolutely.
Kate?
All of it, yeah. I should have shut down all my socials profiles and just shut up. I should never have bought into the skirmishes that I got into. It diminished my reputation and led to a whole, the pile-on just got worse. So, I regret it enormously, but I wasn't in great shape mentally.
General David Morrison, who you mentioned, a key part of your life.
I will be ruthless in ridding the army of people who cannot live up to its values, and I need every one of you to support me in achieving this. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. That goes for all of us, but especially those who by their rank have a leadership role.
What did it mean, I guess, for you to write that very iconic respect speech, which of course became this widely shared, incredibly galvanising speech? Did you know at the time, I mean, you've mentioned how you've got the gift of being able to come up with the quippy lines and the powerful statements and being a very gifted speechwriter and orator. Did you know at the time?
No. I can still remember that morning really vividly. And again, I was in pretty patchy shape. And the Jedi Council issue had blown up for a while. I can still remember that in that afternoon, and Matty Pearce, who's gone on to be a general, commander of Forces Command, great fella, Matt, engineer officer, and he was the military aide to the chief. And Matt and I were good mates. I can still remember we were waiting to try to get the clearance to write some remarks. The boss wanted to put out an order of the day equivalent to the army about this situation. And there were a bunch of lawyers in there parsing it all and, trying to, all this passive voice bullshit, making steeples, churches with their fingers and nodding very sagely. And in the end, I just said, listen, do you want a fucking speech or not? And sorry, that was a bit coarse of me, but that's what I said. And I said, tell you what I'm going to do. One draft, that's it. Now I'm going home. And I winked at Matt. I just went out and wrote an email to the chief, CC Matt, and it was literally one take. I wrote it.
So it just poured out of you?
Yep. And that's not being grand. It just did. But people dignify it with the term speech. It frankly was written as a script for a video. He did it in one take, but I think it was only about 3.5 minutes of text. I then went home. I couldn't sleep at night, so I was in bad shape. And I said, boss, I'm going to go home if you're happy with that take. And I came in later that day. I went and grabbed some sleep and came in, and the Chief of Staff Army Headquarters is tracking these YouTube views on a graph. It did not for a moment dream that it would become a social media sort of phenomenon.
It really sort of marked this shared purpose, I think, between David Morrison and yourself. But years later, your relationship fractured a little. What happened there? What shifted?
I owe David considerable loyalty. He was very, very good to me. We had a falling out, and this, by the way, all this long predated the Australian of the Year thing. He was instrumental in my survival, I will say that, and he deserves credit for that. I regret that we fell out at some point. I hope that maybe thaws over time. On the Australian of the Year thing, I look back on that now. I should never have accepted the nomination. I felt like I'd been played a bit by that committee, I've got to say. I was nominated in the ACT. I found out later it was Malcolm Farr and I think Helen McCabe, the editor of the Women's Weekly, nominated me. I'd been nominated in ACT. Next thing I know, I'm on the shortlist in Queensland. And it was quite clear what they'd done, as David had been runner-up the year before in ACT and had been invited to come back, clearly with a view to making him Australian of the Year. I didn't know any of that at the time. I shouldn't have accepted the nomination, frankly. in that I had done nothing to warrant that. And I'll tell this to my own discredit. I should not have spoken to the media, but I got caught. I wasn't at all aggrieved that he...
You looked it on stage, I reckon. You looked disappointed, I guess.
Did I? Yeah, I never watched it. I don't know, but I you know what? I just wanted it to end. And there's a whole lot of furore on Twitter about how dare the Australian of the Year be, this allegedly heteronormative male who had profited off the trans woman's speech. And I'd never claimed that speech. Anyone who delivers the speech owns the speech. That's Theodore Sorensen's rule. It's a good rule. It was David Morrison's speech, not mine.
You've mentioned a lot of those cricketers, Usman, you mentioned, and quite a lot of them have a faith, even
They
people
do.
like Justin Langer, Matt Hayden, a lot of them do have a faith. What was their response like when you decided to transition, some of those people that maybe had a framework?
They were unfailingly good. Matty Hayden, I was on the road with a bit. It never detected any hint that his Christianity was an obstacle. JL, I've got a photo in the phone, I'll show you later, that one of the most moving moments of my life, I was asked to do the last post ceremony at the Australian War Memorial on the eve of the Sri Lanka Test, Canberra's first test match. And Cricket Australia asked me to do the ceremony. The team went to that, and JL was the coach at the time, and I got a photo there with Uzi and Pat Cummins and Mitch Stark and a whole bunch of others, and they asked me to come and pose with the team at the Pool of Reflection, which was a beautiful moment. To a person, they were terrific. The ones who humbled me were the Chappell brothers. Ian and Greg were mates of mine anyway, but Ian is...
Well, they almost come from a different era too, right?
Yeah, not by that much. Greg was still playing grade in Brisbane when I was around the grade circuit there, so I knew Greg a little bit. Ian, yeah, very much so. Ian's a different generation and, has a reputation of being this sort of grumpy, prickly character, but he basically, Chappelli couldn't have been better.
After all of these decades, the struggles, the high pressure roles, as you said, describing yourself as someone who's hardwired for anxiety, you have also spoken a little bit, and maybe it's the afternoon that you mentioned, the Jungian afternoon, but this finding stillness and finding solitude in this chapter of life.
Yep.
How have you found that, and what has that meant for you?
Yeah, okay. Well, my separation from alcohol was quite miraculous. I have no rational explanation for how you go from being in the state of mind and body that I was and not drinking again. And it enlivened a spiritual yearning and curiosity in me. What I've noticed, and I think it is a gift of the afternoon of life, very simple, sensual experiences give me enormous pleasure now, in that the subtle changes in the tone, in the light in my street. It's a cathedral in its own right. And another thing that is enormously sensual, I go swimming in the Great Southern Ocean without a wetsuit.
Oh my God, are you crazy?
And that's what the locals say, but I absolutely love it. And maybe it's because I'm a bit prone to depression and stuff, but that jolt of really ice-cold water is extraordinary. I can see why people do these ice baths and why there's all this Nordic solstice swimming and stuff. So the last couple of years, on pain of death, I go to Warrnambool on the solstice and get in the water, and I just love it. I have a spiritual curiosity, and I'm not a finger-wagging fundamentalist, but I have some belief in the numinous. Have a curiosity about whether there's anything beyond our flesh and blood. I don't have a magic answer to that, but I have a sense of hope.
Well, Cate McGregor, I'm so glad you have that sense of hope. Thank you for your candour today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Kelly.
Curveballs produced by Dead Set Studios. This episode was produced by Sarah Dabro and edited by Amelia Navascues. If you liked this episode, do leave us a review or share it with somebody navigating their own unexpected chapter. You can find all of our episodes at curveballshow.com. This episode was produced on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians of people throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging.